Let's do this, and we'll make it so we can get as much in as we possibly can.
What's this pen?
I think it's Greyhawk. I forget.
I think it's Mage Stones.
There we go.
Not again.
Yeah.
All right, hi folks. We are here for the 50 Years of D&D series of panels. We're running 3 today and 3 tomorrow, running from 4 o'clock to 7 o'clock. We just had the wonderful Rose Estes come here and talk to us about her Endless Quest books. And for this slot, we're going to be talking about Ravenloft, another very popular series of books and adventures and such that were produced by TSR and then later by Wizards of the Coast over the years. So my name is Matt Forbeck. I'll be your moderator. Don't worry about me. Then we're going to introduce the rest of these wonderful people out here that actually had something to do with Ravenloft at some point or another. So we'll start with Tracy here.
Yes.
Hi. I'm Tracy Hickman.
And not Mrs. Hickman either.
No, I'm not. No, I'm the ugly Hickman sister. On my way out here, as a matter of fact, I got on a little puddle jumper from Detroit to Indianapolis because, of course, if you fly from Salt Lake to Indy, you have to go through Detroit. And I got on this plane, and there was a fellow that sat across the aisle from me, and I said, "Well, you're going to GenCon?" "Yes, because we can tell from quite a distance." And he said, I said, "What do you play?" He said, "I play D&D." And I said, "Oh, cool. Do you do like homegrown, or do you do the module?" He said, "Whoa, yeah, we do kind of a mixture of both of those things. You know, take Strahd, for example. Strahd's one of those characters that you really kind of have to, let him mix it up a little bit and change it up a little bit so he isn't quite so predictable." I said, "Yeah, but I believe Strahd was kind of designed to be, changed up and a little unpredictable." "Oh yeah, Strahd is a really great character. I think he's going to be, I really enjoy those, but you got to have to change it up a little bit." So we do that a little bit in our game. I said, "I invented Strahd." And he looked at me. No. I didn't have the heart to go on with it, so that's my story.
There we go. That's all you need to say.
That's all I got. Yeah.
You don't want any further introduction than that?
That's it. I mean, y'all can say, yeah, and that's fine.
I can't top that. So, Tracy wrote the Ravenloft module that came first. If you need that refresher, anybody?
Well, Tracy and Laura.
Tracy and Laura.
Yes.
So then later, 1990-ish, I think it was decided that TSR didn't have a horror game because Call of Cthulhu was percolating along really well, and some TSR folks had split off and formed Pacesetter and created Chill. Anybody remember Chill?
Chill, yeah.
It was fun. It really was. So to fill that niche, it was decided TSR would produce the Ravenloft box set, which went great. And then first module, second module. I wrote the second module, Ship of Horror, and it got cooking really well. So then about 4 years later, some genius said, "Let's do Ravenloft, but in the 1890s." And Bill
Like
Connors,
Gaslight Cthulhu.
Yes. So Bill Connors jumped on that to design it, and I jumped on it to edit it, and it was a blast. So we'll talk more about that, but let's let Jim jump in here.
I'm James Lowder. I worked in the book department at TSR starting in '88. I was initially hired to be the person who handled the fiction projects that were going to have heavy game interaction. Because a lot of that was done earlier, like with Tracy with the Dragonlance material with Margaret, a lot of the people working on it were all in-house. By the time '88 rolled around, the company was bringing in authors like Bob Salvatore from outside of the company. So they needed somebody in books who could actually talk to the game department as well, who had a foot in both worlds. I was the initial series editor for Ravenloft and worked on game products such as Dark Lords, created Stezin de Palerno for Dark Lords. I'm also, you may know, the author of Night of the Black Rose, the Ravenloft novel that, as Tracy knows, should not have ever happened, and I didn't ever want to happen, but I ended up being the person to write it. So
We'll have to dig deeper into all
we
that.
can talk, yes.
Well,
All right, let's start out at the beginning, right? So how did Ravenloft come about? What was the impetus for this movie?
That's Tracy's story.
Yep.
Yeah, Ravenloft originally came from an adventure dungeon that I played. Quite frankly, one of 2 games that I actually played. Everything else I DM'd. So, but I was in this game, and it was a typical, at the time, dungeon. Ranch-style design, everything on one level. There wasn't a lot of logic to the architecture. You know, it was apparently kind of a cubist period, and and we're wandering through. Okay, and okay, here's some kobolds. All right, we're going to kill the kobolds. Oh, fine, we fight the kobolds. Okay, fine. We're going. Oh, there's a gelatinous cube. Oh, we're going to run away from the gelatinous cube because it's not that fast anyway. And we turned a corner, and here was a vampire. And I thought, what are you doing here? You're a vampire, for crying out loud. Yeah. You're not some wandering monster table. You know, and I felt really sorry for the vampire, because it's like he didn't really belong here, and he didn't know what he was doing here, and I realized that there are characters and there are creatures that need to be set in their setting, that need to be portrayed in their space in order to fully appreciate the thematic and narrative potentials that those characters have. And the vampire was one of those. I was very heavily influenced by a lot of whale pictures from Universal back in the day, and I wanted a setting that was very much like that. I wanted a castle that was not ranch style. I wanted a castle that had multiple levels to it, and that, like, I don't know, looked like Neuschwanstein. And so we actually studied the history of the vampire and the vampiric, the origins of modern vampire, as well as architecture, period architecture for castles, and how they functioned and how they architecturally worked. One of the early things we discovered was the underlying nature of the vampire myth. One of the earliest modern vampire stories was written by Dr. Polydorus, who was the physician to Byron, and who was present on that same weekend that Mary Shelley was there and wrote Frankenstein. They were all challenged to write some frightening thing. Dr. Polydorus, his contribution was a story called Vampire. And the Vampire story, it has been suggested, I think quite rightly, was Dr. Polydorus's attempt to tell Byron what a monster he was. That he was a predator, and that he preyed on women without, sociopathically, with no consideration for them at all. He was also very much a Bluebeard type character, which is a feminine archetype in feminine story. And the Bluebeard is the too good-looking man who was a murderer of brides. He would seduce them into marriage by his good looks and wealth and promise of prosperity, but in truth, there was in fact a bleeding key. It's part of the structural mythology, and this bleeding key, his latest bride found this bleeding key. He was told never to touch the bleeding key, never to take the bleeding, never to go into the basement. She takes the bleeding key, she goes into the basement, and she opens the door and discovers the corpses of all of the previous brides and realizes what's going on. But the bleeding key bleeds on her clothing, and so she can't conceal the fact now that she knows that he is a monster. Understanding the nature, the underlying nature of the vampire then teaches us who the vampire needs to be in the game. That the vampire is an irredeemable monster. And that no amount of loving him will change that. So at its very heart, the vampire story is a cautionary tale for women to save themselves from the idea of spousal abuse, of relationship abuse, of turning their back on the monster that cannot be redeemed through love. I apologize.
That was pretty damn deep.
I'm sorry, but that is
You're absolutely right.
the origin of all of this, which means, and in fact, when we came back, when Wizards asked me to come back and help them with Curse of Strahd, the very first thing that we talked about was this very basic foundational nature of the vampire. I said, Strahd does not glitter.
Thank you.
And in point of fact, and it is my opinion, and I apologize if that people are offended by this, but it is my opinion that the glittering vampire who can be redeemed by love is in fact a harmful archetype. That it is in fact contrary and counter to the feminine archetype that needs to be taught. So I said Strahd does not glitter. Strahd is a monster. Strahd is a user, he's a sociopath, and he is so self-centered that he cannot see the brokenness of himself. Having gotten to that point then, the creation of Ravenloft as an adventure has at its heart this monster who is unaware of his own monstrousness and who is under firm conviction that he is right and that those who oppose him wrong him. Not our wrongs, but wrong him. We created the castle Ravenloft. Originally the story was called Vampire, the adventure was called Vampire, but we created the castle Ravenloft specifically to support that concept of the wealthy, powerful creature. And very much as a nod to the whale films. As a result that was unexpected, the castle is so vertically broken up that adventurers get lost in it. They can't go very far without really kind of losing track of where they've been and the way out. I nearly killed an entire party 2 months ago just because they wandered into Ravenloft, and I just let them go deeper and deeper until it was time. The castle has that unexpected benefit of characters and players getting lost within it. And the final key actually to the Ravenloft design was of course the Taroka deck, the gypsy reading that Madamita does. The idea that we could use a predictive archetype, a prophetic archetype, to self-fulfill by setting up the end of the game in a different way every time is I think for Ravenloft one of the underlying strengths. to make it unpredictable. Laura and I played what we know now as Ravenloft for years, every Halloween. So it was not just the design of the module, but it was tested over years before we brought it into the company. So you asked where the origins of Ravenloft are. The foundations are probably a lot deeper than you expect, but nevertheless, for me, they inform what Ravenloft is throughout its manifestation.
That's awesome. So moving on from that, this is how it starts. How do we get to fiction? We're actually doing a fiction.
So,
right?
yeah, well, so
That's what that's the third.
there was
Those are great.
when TSR decided, as Ann said, when TSR decided we need this horror setting to compete basically with Call of Cthulhu. The idea is then you expand out from that center with the universal horror and all of the themes that Tracy was talking about. Everybody who was working on it, Bruce Nesmith and Bill Connors and Andrea Hayday, were all very conscious of what Tracy had been trying to do. You expand that out by using then other horror archetypes. So you tap Frankenstein and you do all of these other horror archetypes from those classic sources, and you build up the domains around the central concept that Tracy and Laura created, with the Dark Lord being connected to the domain. And this is both their demesne and their prison, because it's this dual nature of their relationship to the land. And then you expand that and do that for each of the Dark Lords. And you don't understand the Dark Powers because nobody understands what the Dark Powers are. They are there to torment the Dark Lords, maybe the characters that fall into the mist, maybe not. You can't really tell. And then the box set gets built up around that. And so as Dark Lords get added, the central motivation is, for the designers, is follow that same archetype that Tracy and Laura created with Strahd, and then just do it with other characters and explore other archetypes for horror. Tied with that was the decision that we were going to do fiction that was released pretty much simultaneous. The Ravenloft fiction line was going to launch about the same time as the box set, which was unusual for this because there was usually lag between the setting being created and then the fiction being done. And initially the idea was there were going to be, when I was brought in to do to be the series editor, there were 2 books on the schedule. The Strahd sort of centered book, which would tie to the Forgotten Realms, which was very successful. So we're going to bring a character from the Forgotten Realms, and they're going to encounter Strahd, and the book will take place largely in Barovia and the castle. And then we'll do a Dragonlance story, and the decision was from the start, from upper management, that Soth was going to be the character brought in to become a Dark Lord, because Margaret and Tracy were largely off working on other things, and Soth was so cool and such an amazing character that we'll do this with him. My first job as line editor was to say, for God's sake, stop doing this sort of thing with characters that mean a lot to the writers. We shouldn't be doing this respect the creators with. And I tried to get Knight of the Black Rose killed.
It's hard to do, he's undead.
Wait, right. as I found out. So what we did, the solution that we had for Vampire of the Mist was Christy Golden, who was an author I had discovered in the slush, the unsolicited manuscripts in the book department. Christy was somebody I had identified as a potential writer for the company. She had never published fiction before. She came in to do Vampire, and she got to create Jander. Jander is her character. And we just created a backstory that he came from the Forgotten Realms, and then he becomes the character that interacts with Strahd, which allowed that book to not mess with Strahd's story. It's a character reacting to that story, not Strahd doing a narrative arc, which made it a much more, an easier book to do, because it was giving Christie authorial voice and the ability to create Jander and do interesting things with Jander. And obviously that worked too, because that book is, you know, and still very, very popular. The trick with Night of the Black Rose, I should be drinking something else to talk about this. The trick with Night of the Black Rose was Soth was supposed to be the central character of the story from the start, which is a mistake, because Soth's identity is, as Tracy was saying, like Strahd's, a villain who is convinced that they're right and not going to make that great self-revelation discovery that would undo that character as designed. So I initially called Margaret. It was the first time I ever spoke to Margaret, and said, well, if you guys want to come, you and Tracy want to come and write this book, you can. And they said no for good reasons. I offered to keep them involved in it and let them know what my opinion was of where this was going. We went through and got another author. There are flats, book cover flats for Night of the Black Rose with this other author's name on them and in catalog copy, because another author had been hired to do that book. That fell apart for reasons that aren't really public discussion reasons. But that author then left the project. I tried again to get the book killed. See, this is fate. We shouldn't be doing this book. Let's just kill it. We'll come up with another character. We'll do what we're doing with Jander in the Forgotten Realms. We'll create another Dragonlance character and bring them in, and that'll be the tie. Nope. We have this Clyde Caldwell painting. It's great. We are, yeah, see, it's going to happen. So we ran another round of auditions for people to write Night of the Black Rose, and all of the proposals were bad. Soth got sparkly. You know, people were, this is what I'm going to do to redeem this character. They were all messing with Soth. And finally, Mary Kirchhoff, who was running the department, called me into her office and said, you're the only person who understands what this book needs to do. You're going to have to write this. And I'd done Crusade. I'd already written a novel and some other things for the company, so they, you know, I was tested as a writer for them. And, you know, I went home and thought about it, and it was, okay. And so the premise for Night of the Black Rose is metatextual. It's, you know, this is a spoiler, I guess. The Night of the Black Rose, it's been out for long enough, sorry. Soth forgets his story over the course of Night of the Black Rose, and I built in, and I told Margaret and Tracy this, and I told TSR this. I have built into this book how you get Soth back when Margaret and Tracy come back and they want the character. Here's the escape hatch. It's built into the book. Soth forgets his story. When he remembers his story again truthfully, he's out. And that doesn't change who he is. It actually confirms the story as Margaret and Tracy told it, without making him sparkly and changing all of that. And so that was the proposal I put together and ended up writing it. Those first two books sold incredibly well and still sell incredibly well. They've been translated around, in terms of the newer fiction lines that the company created. Ravenloft was, at least initially for the first half dozen books, the most successful line. There have been 12 or 14 translations of Vampire the Mist and Night of the Black Rose. And then from there, we moved off and Christie did a couple of more books, Rob King did a couple of books. I built that line so that authors could pitch individual stories that stood alone and could have strong authorial voices. And you know, don't mess with everybody else's characters again, please, we're not doing that. So that was the genesis for that, and that was when Anne came in, that had already just been underway.
And I think if you're probably picking up on something here that we're kind of skirting around, but I feel like Ravenloft as a setting more than any other pays really strict attention to the bad guys' motivations. So that is what's driving their story. That's what's driving the adventures. It isn't just a dragon sitting on a pile of treasure somewhere,
Right.
waiting for adventurers to knock on the door. But you know, there's a lot of in-depth into why does Castle Ravenloft look the way it does? Why is the box set constructed? Why are the adventures? When I did Ship of Horror, all I could think about was this guy's on this island, and what does he want, and why is he here, and what's fun for him, which of course is evil, but yeah, and anybody who's attempting to write adventures, fiction, whatever, that motivation is always key. That is how you're going to find where your story needs to go.
Right.
And I think Ravenloft pays tons of attention to that motivation.
Well, the thing that, one of the other parts that's really interesting about Ravenloft is the setting, and what Tracy and Laura did in that original module is amazing, because Dungeons and Dragons as a game system doesn't necessarily play well for horror.
Right.
Call of Cthulhu does, because it's built in with the standing game mechanic in Call of Cthulhu. I worked for Chaosium for 7 years doing stuff for them as well, so I kind of live in this horror role-playing game space. It's built in that the more you learn in Call of Cthulhu, the worse it gets for you. And that's antithetical to the way D&D experience points and hit points and all of that are built as you go up levels. So to do successful horror with that game system is incredibly hard, which is part of the reason the original Ravenloft module is so remarkable. And that's actually my first interaction with Ravenloft, was as a player playing that. And so as we did the design for the fiction and for the game material, it was constantly that tension between what eventually became called Doveloft and Ravenloft. So are we going to do, you know, Ravenloft as genuine horror, or are we going to do Doveloft, which is sort of fantasy light, Hammer horror-esque fantasy? And that became a real debate point in the Ravenloft group by the mid-90s, and followed it all the way through to Wizards of the Coast.
Awesome. So, yeah, the one thing that struck me about Ravenloft the first time I saw it was just the isographic maps, right? It was like the first time I'd ever seen anything
Right.
like that done in a dungeon. It's like, oh my God, you can actually take this and turn it and see how everything works together.
Right, and that was from Tracy's, with the construction
Yeah,
of Castle
seriously,
Ravenloft.
brilliant design,
It was
yeah.
built into it, yeah.
Well, but the map itself was created by Dave Sutherland.
Yep.
Oh, wow.
And I presented him with level maps for all the different pieces, but the isometric map was created by Dave.
Right.
He's the one who gave it that brilliant dimensionality that everyone could intrinsically follow.
Yep.
You could just look at it and know how it worked. It was a beautiful, simple approach to a complex problem, and provides us still to this day a clear picture of what's going on in the castle, no matter where the players are.
Right.
That was Dave's just brilliant contribution.
Yeah, he had the brain for that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yep.
It blew my mind away when I first saw it. Do we have any questions out here? We want to see if anybody has anything specific they want to ask. Right here.
Linking the stories together, once you had the domains of dread, linking the stories together, the grand conjunction, where did that come from?
There was an impetus in the company as a whole to create massive narrative cross, what transmedia now, events. And part of that was Dragonlance initially did that, but in 88, 89, with the Avatar trilogy and the modules connected to that, which were for the Forgotten Realms, supposed to explain the transition from first to second edition in the Forgotten Realms, first and second edition D&D in the Forgotten Realms, told as a story. It was wildly successful and was the third novel, Waterdeep, Troy Denning's book, was the first New York Times bestseller for the Forgotten Realms. The company saw how successful Avatar was because it was at least about 4 or 5 game products, the 3 novels, the DC Comics tied into it, things like that. That grand, big event storyline was something that the company looked at much more seriously, and that was where that manifested in Ravenloft.
Actually, over here, let's
One
go.
more question about that same thing. Like how Paizo does like the adventure arc, the long game, was that TSR's first time doing that long connected?
No, because that would have been the Dragonlance
Yeah,
module.
Dragonlance would have been
The first, because the mid-'80s Dragonlance modules did that, initially tied to the fiction, but then spinning off from the fiction.
Yeah, and they had kind of built that with the Giants and the Slater series and all that before, but that was more coincidental than design.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dragonlance was the first attempt to actually long narrative form
Yep.
construction within an adventure series.
Yep.
That was based on Laura and my earlier work in what we called night ventures in Faro and in the Hacienda. But what I think we also need to remember is no one had ever done that.
Right.
We didn't have the tools yet. We had to make the tools to create story in games. And the very early efforts were not always successful.
Right.
They weren't always, compared to what we would expect these days. A lot of people looked at Dragonlance, certainly the earlier adventures in Dragonlance, and felt that they were really too much on rails. And they were. But they were too much on rails because we really didn't know how not to be on the rails.
Exactly, and that happened with the first Avatar modules too, and then when we got to Empires, we thought, oh, wait a minute, we need to take the rails off.
Yeah, we could break out.
We can break out of that. We'll actually do scenarios, the modules for Empires, which was done, I was the editor on Avatar and the editor on Empires, and the project director for those. And for Empires, we looked back at what Margaret and Tracy and everybody who had done the original Dragonlance stuff did, which we mostly replicated for Avatar, and then said, we can take rails off, so Troy's scenarios for that, the modules, run parallel to the novels. They don't replicate the novels, which changes.
Dragonlance has some roots for Ravenloft as it later came along, which is why we're talking about it here.
Yep.
Where the novels for Ravenloft were also very instructive. Or excuse me, the novels for Dragonlance were also very instructive later in terms of Ravenloft.
Yep.
Because when we did the first novel, Autumn Twilight, we already had the adventures written that were covered by that narrative. And so we were trying to write narrative to game.
Yep.
And this is why people when they read Autumn Twilight today, they can hear the dice rolling in the back of the book. And it's true. And the characters all march around through that first book like a tour group. It's like, let's follow the flag to Zok-Sarath. Okay. We all go over there. Well, let's go back to Sol. And that's because that's how adventures play.
Right.
But it's not necessarily how narrative works.
Right.
What then happened is we did the first book, and the first book was much to management's surprise selling.
Right.
And they said, well, let's do another one. Okay.
Can you have it next week? Okay.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that.
No, that actually was true. We had this huge short runway to get this done. But the adventures hadn't caught up to that.
Right.
And so when we get to DL5, I think it is, that takes place in Tarsus, and we actually follow the western course, the western branch. when we got to that point in the narrative, we were writing the story before the game.
Yep.
And as a consequence, we immediately split the party
Right.
at the beginning of the second book, and we send one group over here and one group over there, and we have two narrative lines that take place instead of one, and we have character interactions that are far more natural and manageable
Right.
in both of these than we did before. So what we actually discovered at that point is that it's far better to write, it's far better to make games to a book
Yes.
than it is to write a book to a game.
Right. And so, and that's a great point, because that's exactly what happened. The transition from, and this is all happening in the span of about 6 years, right? Even less than that,
Yeah.
for the changes, for all of this happening, for, well, we're going to do this now, and we've got all of the modules and everything else for Dragonlance being done, by this relatively tight group, to we're making conscious decisions for how the fiction for Ravenloft is going to be done so that it interacts with Strahd. So Jander is the character that does the changing, and that allows Christie to write a good novel, because a good novel is different from a good game. And we're trying to do it in ways that respect the game material, that then makes the fiction a gateway in. So when you start doing Grand Conjunction, that's actually going back and figuring out, all right, well now how are we going to make this arc, for this story arc for the game material, link over several modules in ways that then are informed by what the experimentation that was done with Dragonlance leads to. And it's all being done in real time. But this is, and with incredibly tight deadlines. This is on the schedule, make this the best you can do. Oh, let's try to do something completely novel with the form.
And something to think about, I joined TSR in 1989, and the philosophy, without even realizing it, was, let's throw it at the wall and see what sticks. I mean, we were experimenting with all kinds of things. The industry was still very new. And it was like, well, let's try this game line. Let's move people over there. And we didn't know what was going to be popular or not.
Right.
And in fact, I read things now occasionally online like, wow, when TSR did this, boy, was that ever done. Well, nobody had ever done it
kidding.
before.
Right, yeah.
So,
Fantastic. How about over here?
So Tracy, or maybe Jim will know, did TSR ever want you to, or we are interested in writing a non-fiction?
At the time, Margaret and I were so busy
Right.
with projects. I mean, that, okay, that's part of it.
I was going to offer the other part if you weren't going to. I'll say it. They treated Tracy and Margaret badly. So, there was, and this was why Soth wasn't being used by Margaret and Tracy, because, there was conflict with the company, and it was all the company's fault. And this was, eventually, all right, so this is a Ravenloft panel. Screaming Tower and the Ebonok trilogy. I left TSR for the same reason for why Margaret and Tracy were treated badly. Anybody who's read Ben Rigg's book Slaying the Dragon knows how well I got along with the book department. And actually how Margaret and Tracy were treated was part of what radicalized me in how authors should be treated. Because they were not respected. Because, and this is, we've been talking about Dragonlance and the original modules and everything else. None of this exists. The box set, the fiction line, all of that stuff does not exist without what Tracy and Laura and Margaret and Tracy had done with Dragonlance. Without them, it's not there for the company to do, or for any of the creators who came after them to work on without them. And TSR never got that. So,
we were employees, and we were just another set of the people who worked in the cubicle land upstairs. but we weren't. We had changed. We had changed the way they made money. We had changed the way games were viewed. We had brought in revenues that had previously been completely untapped, but we were still employees. The way we viewed it at the time is that TSR, the brand, wanted to be the star.
Right.
It was people bought stuff from TSR because it was TSR, not because Jim had done the book,
Right.
not because I had written the adventure or Margaret had done the text.
The author names were not going on the spines of the books, so they would be shelved in the bookstore as TSR books, not as Hickman and Weiss books.
And
So if you go back and look at those,
Yeah, which is stunning by today's standards.
Right.
Yeah.
I can remember thinking at the time that TSR could have been, if they had wished,
right,
the farm club. The place where people with talent and ideas could come and be allowed to do their work
right,
and become stars to their credit
right.
and their profit. But they never seemed to understand the benefit in that.
And
It was sad for us.
yeah, oh, absolutely. And that was in-house, it was sad too, because, and the pendulum went back and forth. There were points at which we pushed it, and what I was saying earlier about the Ravenloft standalone novels. So Rob King writes, one of Rob's books, and we're purposefully setting this up, and this was the way Mary Kirchhoff let me do this with the Harper's line and with the Ravenloft line. We were setting these up so those authors would have authorial voice and they would actually be foregrounded, and we were advertising those books as books by these authors because exactly what Tracy said was a root problem with the way the company treated people. That worked for a while up until 92, 93, and then it starts swinging back again. But the reason for that was because the company wants its name over the individual creators, and whether they're freelance or whether they're staff. And it's worse if you're staff.
In the back there.
Question for Tracy. From what I understand, while your name and Laura's name is on Ravenloft 2, The House on Griffin Hill, you actually just submitted an outline that was completed by other people. How much does the finished product reflect your and Laura's vision?
The House on Griffin Hill was from our perspective, House on Griffin Hill was something we had started and were working on, and we were tossed off the product. This was partly because, almost certainly because I had quit the company, and I had quit the company over this very problem. Consequently, they didn't want us to be messing with their stuff for whatever reason that may be, and they took the project away from us and gave it to somebody else to complete. They left our names on it, but
They're happy to benefit from that name,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
they're not happy
Yeah.
to give you control to.
So while we had done the basic structure of it, it had been it wasn't that we like gave them an outline and then they finished it. It was that we were actively working on it and they took it from us.
So one quick amplification.
I know this is not really married stuff.
Yeah. So but
It is
this
Ravenloft.
is
It is Ravenloft, I mean, we are talking horror stories.
now grim tales from the domains of dread. That to amplify something that was said before, and when Rose was here in the panel before this talking about the EQ books, and Rose was not treated terribly well by TSR either.
Yeah.
Rose, Margaret, and Tracy saved TSR in the 80s. The company doesn't make it to the 1990s without the Endless Quest books and the success of the Dragonlance books. And then the book department in the late 80s and 90s when I was working there, we were selling, and you know, it's what Tracy was saying about this being a farm team, and this goes to like what I was talking about with the Ravenloft sales. There was a point in 1991 where TSR, we had a managing editor, 3 editors in the book department, 1 part-timer, and an editorial assistant, which is tiny. And we're writing the art orders, and this is the other part of all of this.
Yeah.
We're doing all of this stuff. We're doing art orders, we write back cover copy, we do all of this stuff. We draw maps, and then Dave Sutherland makes them brilliant. We published 23 novels in that year. We had the largest percentage of bestsellers in the country for science fiction and fantasy at B. Dalton's and Walden's, which were the biggest publishers in the country, bookstores
yeah.
in the country. We beat out Random House publishing 200 books. We had a larger percentage of bestsellers than Random House, all of the big conglomerate publishers in New York. With that tiny department at TSR, that's how much the company punched above its weight. Because of the content, because of the Dragonlance and Ravenloft and all of that IP that were created by individuals.
I remember hearing in that era that we were the #2 publisher of fantasy fiction in the world.
Yeah, it was crazy,
Yeah.
crazy.
Over here.
I've run the 5th edition Curse of Strahd hardcover several times, but I'm relatively a newcomer to Ravenloft, and I've always been curious about the origins of the Amber's Temple location in the hardcover. Does that come out of the novel?
Actually, the Amber Temple location was something that I gave to the hardback group as part of the week that I spent there. We went, for that matter, the phrase "is no good is no Blinsky" is actually mine. So the Amber Temple actually was part of the constructs that I gave to the team. You know, no illusions here. I did not create that magnificent work of Curse of Strahd, but the Amber Temple location actually was originally inspired by the Amber Room, which is the Eastern European room that was taken by the Nazis, disassembled, taken by the Nazis, but has since disappeared.
It's still missing.
It's still missing.
Yeah.
And so I thought, what an intriguing concept that would be. And so the Amber Temple was part of the outline structures that came out of that amazing week that I spent up there. With the team. I do want to say that Laura and I both feel that Curse of Strahd is a remarkable incarnation of our original vision. They were it was one of those wonderful times when they actually listened to us.
When the pendulum swung the right way.
When the pendulum swung the right way, and they listened to us and were able to translate the core what we envision, and to interpret and extrapolate from that something that I'm very proud of what they did, and in Curse of Strahd. For me, it resonates with our vision beautifully.
That's fantastic. That's actually, we're at time right now, and I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I know we had more questions. I'd love to be doing this for another couple hours. But I want to thank all you guys for coming here and illuminating my understanding of all this, and for everybody else here too.